Welcome to this month's Schuman Talk, where we discuss issues we face in Europe today in the light of Robert Schumann's vision for a community of peoples deeply rooted in Christian values. For it was on May the 9th, 1950, at 6 p.m., when the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman gave a 3-minute speech in which he laid the foundation for the European house, where today 450 million Europeans live together in peace. I see this as being the defining moment of post-war Europe, for it launched the European movement for peace and unity that has led to today's European Union. And this also was a very key factor in the collapse, the implosion of communism about 30 years ago, 35 years ago now, and has also been a major influence in the events taking place further east, with the continuation, if you like, of the revolution. So our guest today is Professor Yaroslav Hrytsak, and from Ukraine, which is a country aspiring to the freedom and independence enjoyed by the EU nations. Yaroslav, as he asked me to call him, is a professor of history at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. He's taught in Columbia and Harvard universities in America, Central European University in Budapest. And Timothy Snyder calls him one of the greatest Ukrainian thinkers and scholars today. And we see highlighted there the book, Ukraine, The Forging of a Nation, which, if you're serious about understanding more about the history of Ukraine, I recommend that as a very good starting point. And that's what we're going to explore together today. So welcome, Yaroslav, to this program. You are the author of numerous publications on modern Ukrainian and Eastern European history. You won a number of international awards for academic achievement and public services, and it's a real privilege to have you as our guest on the Schuman Talk today.
Thank you so much, Jeff. For having me. It's a great pleasure and honor. Thank you so much.
Now, if I guess right, you're in your mid-60s, and about half your life was lived under communism, including your student years. So what influenced you to study Ukraine's history?
Frankly speaking, I didn't have intention to study Ukrainian history. I was a young, ambitious, and probably stupid young man because I thought to study ancient Egypt, to be Egyptologist, so to say. But at some moments I started to realize that there's no chance to do such career in the Soviet Union. So I shifted to local history, and it looked to me very boring, I have to say. Because at that time, Ukrainian history was not quite forbidden in the United States, but was reduced to some kind of very boring, simplistic version. But that quite of a sudden come upon a book written by a Canadian-American scholar, Ivan Lysak-Rudnitsky, and opened my eyes. Because it was the first time that I realized to what extent Ukrainian history is important, interesting, because he put Ukrainian history in the larger, most European context. And it gave me a sense. And this actually gave me a sense, also gave me impetus, how to rethink Ukrainian history, because I started realizing this is something which we reverse while doing. And it's very important also in the not just for academic reasons, but also as a kind of the political project.
Now, I've heard it said that those were the days when only the future was certain. It was the past that kept on changing. Which
this was the old Soviet joke at that time.
Yeah, right. And it leads me to the question, why is truth and truth-telling in history so important?
The thing is that for the last 30 or 40 years, history was in deep crisis. And one part of the crisis was some kind related with the collapse of the Nazism, communism, all the kind of ideologies, because the presumption that these ideologies very much relied on history or history telling, and they were claiming the such history truths, all the kind of things, and therefore it was considered to be very dangerous. It will be dangerous to have some narrative. This is the work or criticism has been done mostly by the postmodernists, and they claim that basically there is not such thing like a truth, also historical truth. It's dangerous to seek for the truth because it's a concept. It's just not natural concept, but the concept to dominate. so say over the political body, all the kind of things. So what I'm telling you, there's a lot of historians who have some kind of concern, or didn't believe that there's something like historical truth. This is subjective telling. So what I'm driving at, to a large extent, this concept has collapsed with the collapse of the communism, and most importantly with the recent events in Ukraine, especially Maidan and War. So let me just make the long story short. There are several books that have appeared since then, which claim that history truth does exist. And it's very important to think for this. It doesn't mean to say that we have to reveal the truth, because it's very hard, the whole truth. So to say 100% truth, this is something which is impossible. But doesn't mean we have to stop striving for it. So say if this is we couldn't achieve the 100% of the certainty, let's strive with 61 or at 62 or 75, so to say. We have to proceed, because otherwise, if we don't do it, we use our dignity, both as historians and human beings, because the striving for truth is very important. This is exactly what the historians do. And more important in Ukraine, because Ukraine shows there are some truths, there are some values, so to say, which are really important, which people already sacrifice for that, their health, quite sometimes even their life. So this is just this imagination, so to say. I believe, so this is exactly where, again, when the academic pursuit and political agenda, they come together at some point, and I believe this point is very important.
Now, a lot of people would just look at the conflict going on between Russia and Ukraine as just being something political, economic, military, etc. But it really seems to be the direct result of a false narrative. Certain ideas, particularly Vladimir Putin has in his mind, that has led to this clash that would never have happened had he not held on to these ideas. Now, for most of us as Westerners, we know very little. Really, we've learned very little at school about Ukrainian and Russian history from that point of view. It just wasn't relevant for our daily lives, from our Western perspective. I mean, history as such is also just pushed aside, let alone the history of our own countries, let alone the history of a place like Ukraine or Russia. But now, with more people realizing that the outcome of this war has huge implications for the whole world order and peace in Europe, we need a crash course in this topic. And so I'd like to ask you to help us understand how this current war or special operation is a result of Putin's particular view of history.
So I would say that we have to strive for history, but for a certain type of history, which I call critical history or rethinking history, so to say. This is the only way to deal with history. Is as Oscar Wilde put it very nicely, that we have only one duty toward the history, and it's to rethink and to rewrite it. And this is something which I believe part of our agenda. So this is exactly what Putin is not doing, because his vision of history is far from being critical, so to say. If I may say so, that to a large extent, war between Ukraine and Russia is war on history. Because if you look closer to the arguments of the Putin, most of these arguments with which he legitimizes his aggression against Ukraine is of historical character. He uses history as instrument, as a weapon, so to say. And I would say there are two basic, if Putin would not commit any other crimes, I believe he'll be just punished for the way he used the history. So I believe he commits two large crimes or breaks against the historical thinking. And the first one is so-called golden rule of history. You probably heard it. This is quotation which very often heard. And this sounds like that. The past is different country. They do everything different there. Which means to be there's constant changes. The only thing which is constant in history is a change, or changes, so to say. And Putin claims there's no changes, because basically he says that Russia existed at least 40,000 years, which is a nonsense to say. Because Russia more or less emerged like most of the nations in the late medieval or early modern times, 16th, 18th century, or thing like that. And basically the way the Putin think, it was exactly the way of thinking 19th century. Because exactly this 19th century is a period of creating this kind of national myth about some kind of eternity. But nations were looking some kind of their roots in the ancient time, in the pre-ancient time, all that kind of thing, which nowadays considered very, so to say, with a grain of salt by most of the historians, even not historians, but people we know that this was not true. But related to that, I would say that Putin is very much man of 19th century, but related to that is also his view on Ukraine and Russia, because his basic view is that Russia and Ukraine is very much divided by language or as ethnic criteria, which is very 19th century view. And more, let's say, more to the point, it's a very German concept of nation, which emerged in the 19th century, opposed to the French concept, because, you know, there's a German-French rivalry, against which Schuman very much was fighting. And this is again the idea that Schuman came with the idea of former general reconciliation, but it was the idea of the 19th century, was the 20th century. In the 19th century, German ideologists think that Germany is defined by language. The thing is that how far the German language sounds, there is a Germany. So in this sense, Austria was a Germany, Swiss was a Germany, so to say. And even the east of Europe, because there were some regions, including my native region, when there were a lot of German language, so therefore they were kind of the large Germany. And this is exactly where Hitler built his idea of the Reich, because Reich was supposed to be German-speaking territories. And this is exactly the way of thinking of Putin. Putin believes that the main basis of Russian identity is Russian language. So far, the Russian language is heard, so there must be a Russia. And since significant part of Ukraine is Russian-speaking, and the large number of Ukrainians are Russian-speaking, they must be Russians. So this is exactly what Putin makes his claim. Since they are Russian-speaking, this must be Russia, which again is nonsense. Because the closest example or parallel that Ukrainian historians draw at this time, they say, look at the Irish. They speak English, but they still are they Irish. And they say, this was the prognosis. Even if Ukrainians stopped, all the Ukrainians, as a result of Russification, at one day stopped talking Ukrainian and shifted to Russians, it would make them Russians. They were still Ukrainians because it's a language that defined them. This is something very much different. This is mostly political traditions, the way they see themselves, their society, their relation with the state, all that kind of thing, which is very alien to what Putin is saying. But basically, again, what I'm saying, Putin is very much historical man, but in 19th century terms, and he's contaminating with history. He's not contaminating history, he's also contaminating Russia per se, because Russia is very deeply, so to say, mirrored in history, and this is very dangerous. If I may add this along my talk, somebody said, I don't remember who was that, most probably some of the French historians, that history is probably the strongest chemistry that is worked by our mind. In some relations, or in some relations, it could be a medicine, or in some relations could be toxic stuff. So what I mean to say, it's exactly the point. Putin is intoxicated himself and intoxicated whole Russia, and it's extremely dangerous because it leads to war.
Yes, according to Putin's logic, America should be part of the British Empire then.
Without a doubt, no doubt about that.
Not sure what Trump. Well, I do know what Trump would think about that. Let's try and break this down more into how Putin's narrative. It begins with the origin of the whole Russia, where Russia comes from, Belarus, Ukraine, and the Kievan Rus. Where does his narrative differ from, say, your narrative? Where does that begin?
So basically, he says the Kiev Rus was Russia. So therefore, it's 1,000 years of Russian history. So I would say Rus was not Russia, neither was Ukraine, because it's quite different from some parallel here, because we could talk about Empire of Charlemagne, which covered territory nowadays French, Germany, and Italy. So whose state is that? French, German, Italian. It's nonsense. So the same extent like a German Empire of Charlemagne was neither French nor German nor Italian, to the same extent Kiev Rus was neither Ukrainian, Russian, Belarusian state. It was just an empire that was imposed, created by the Vikings on the East European territories, Slavic territories, which has a lot of Turkish nomads, and also the Hungarians, all the kind of thing, which is typically early medieval empire, which is not a national state. And this is exactly what I'm talking with. So this is the biggest difference, so to say. because we think historically, and we think historically about the changes. And my point is that Rus was not a nation, Rus was empire, and it took a special effort and some historical conditions, some contingency when this Rus was transformed into nations, including Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. But this is quite different story. And we discussed on what circumstances, how it comes, and also why this transformation make Russia and Ukraine that much different. But this is another part of the story, and I believe we'll tell you later when you'll be answering your question.
Yeah, Putin argues that Ukraine was not a real nation, and of course he shocked George W. Bush when he was visiting him on his ranch. When he made this point, he said, "Well, they don't really deserve to exist. They were created by Soviet decisions." Um, Help us understand how different the course of Ukrainian history was from Russian history. Now, it's all very complicated with different layers and so forth, but help us understand the European engagement that was really over many centuries for Ukraine, that was not the case for Russia.
There is a stereotypical thinking. The stereotypes goes that Ukraine was in the shadow of Russia, or has been shadow of Russia, and it's very much anachronical because and incorrect, because basically Russian fact in Ukrainian history is relatively recent. It started 17th century only for a part of Ukrainian territories nowadays, and mostly it's the 19th and 20th century, so to say. So the last more or less 200, 250, 200 and a half centuries. Before that, Ukraine was a part of another space. And the space was very much related to what we nowadays can Europe and Catholic Europe or Western Europe, whatever you define that. And basically just give you probably one example that tells you a lot. If you're talking about the Kiev Rus and their rulers, so to say, we have a very detailed statistics of their marriages of their sons and daughters. So the statistic runs like that. 75% of all the marriages, 3/4, were to the west, to England, to France, to German lands, to Scandinavian lands, to Hungary and Poland. Only 25 was to north and to Byzantium, so to say. So in this sense, Rus was a typical European state. If you mean Europe at that time, what was meant by that time, which is basically Christian community, and difference between Eastern and Western Christianity was not that important at that time. So this tells you a lot about the story. So basically, Ukrainians claim Rus as their initial state just by the fact that Rus was very much related to Europe and Ukraine, but that Ukrainians by that token means that understood that they're also part of this legacy, because in their understanding, Ukraine is Rus plus Europe. And this exactly runs against the statement of Putin, because Putin tries to say that West was always alien, always foreign, always a danger for Rus, which is a nonsense, so to say. So when I say to reduce a simple formula, if I may, this is probably not simple, but not too simple. Ukraine is Rus plus Europa, while in imagination of Putin, Russia is Rus minus Europe. And this minus plus make a big difference, so to say, because Ukrainians, I mean, in the core of Ukrainian identity, is the exact statement that we belong to another space. Politically, yes, for the last 200 centuries, we happen to be in the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, but still, historically speaking, for a larger period, we're the part of other space, which is now related more or less to Western Europe. I don't know whether I could proceed. Just give you one example how Putin was wrong, because he doesn't understand what he's talking about. Remember this golden rule: past is foreign country, they do everything different there. So one of the statements when Putin put his emphasis that Ukraine has never existed, because there was historical names of Ukraine and Rus and Russia, which is the Ukraine was a little Rus and Russia was a big Rus, or great Rus. So he claims this kind of hierarchy. Great Rus, Great Russia is an older brother that is used for the more time, and it's kind of he claimed this, which is a nonsense, because basically old Rus, little Rus, and the Great Rus is related to the ancient use of this term. which basically come from the ancient Greece. Because you may remember or not, Greek history, Greece history very much related to colonization, so to say, of the outright region. So basically, late Greece was the territory from which where ancient Greek immigrated was so-called little Greece, and the territory they immigrated to, like Italy, was called Great Greece. So actually, little doesn't mean smaller; it means core, even of better quality, centralization. So look at Little Rus and Greater Rus, it's not about the status, hierarchy. It just means to say that this civilization started in Ukraine, nowadays Ukraine, but not in Russia. Not in Moscow, but in Kiev. But this again, different meaning, and it takes historian to explain the simple fact, which most people like Putin are now not aware, or they pretend they're not aware of this fact.
So it's like we might talk about central London and greater London.
Or you could call it in Polish case there is a little Poland which is Krakow, which is capital, and there's a great Poland which is Warsaw, or Britain, which is French region, and Great Britain. So basically, we have this lack of respect of this great. It has nothing to do with the size. It has nothing to do with hierarchy. It means that's the core and the outside region.
It's where it expanded to.
Yeah. So in this sense, Ukrainian history is much older in terms of the written sources, because basically civilization started there, especially mostly literacy. It emerges in this territory, nowadays Kiev. So this is the point.
So give us a timeline. Kiev, when was Kiev established? When was Moscow established? When was St. Petersburg established?
So Kiev was established we don't know, there is discussion about that. We would definitely claim that Kiev existed already in 9th century, 9th, 10th century.
So 1200 years.
Yes, and this was among the largest European cities, until the middle 13th century was destroyed by Mongols. So Moscow emerged 3 centuries later, in the middle of the 13th century, and Petersburg emerged only in the 18th century. It was built by the Peter. So you could see this kind of chronology.
Yeah.
Really shows you the dynamics of these processes.
Yes, after he visited here in Amsterdam, and he wanted to build a kind of a second Amsterdam. How do you build a city on a swamp? So that dates St. Petersburg, indeed. But Putin uses history as a tool of political legitimacy and expansionism. He selectively glorifies aspects, but there are huge pieces of Ukraine's history that he overlooks. The Holodomor, for example. Tell us what we ought to know about Ukraine history that he leaves out.
You mean by the Putin, or what is that?
Putin leaves out of in his scenario of Ruski Mir. What is he leaving out of Ukraine's history that really is an essential part of your identity?
Basically, here is everything that makes Ukrainian different from Russian, and it's basically history, because it's history that makes these two nations very much different. Also, the way they think themselves about themselves. So let me put this way again to counteract this argument about language. So Putin claims that Ukrainian Russians are either very similar or even the same nation, because they speak the language which is either the one or very similar to each other. So first of all, Ukrainian and Russian language are not the only language which is spoken in this territory, and Ukrainian is much more related to Belarusian and Polish language than to Russian, but it's not known by most of the foreigners, so to say. So Russian is not the only language, but it's not about the language itself, because I believe the major difference, and this is what most of the Ukrainian historians was trying to emphasize, the main difference is not in language and political traditions, in a sense that Ukrainian history is told bottom up, so to say. It's mostly history of the organization, civil society. Even there was no state, there was still some institutions who were building Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian culture, which tried to modernize in a very European way, so to say. Why Russian history is written bottom down, top down, so to say. Because basically Ukrainian history is a history of society. And Russian history is mostly history of the state. And this is crucial difference. If I may continue here, a major symbol of Ukrainian history is Cossacks. Cossack as a freedom fighters. I'm not going into details whether this is true or not, but this is the founding myth. So the story is that you have both Ukrainian Cossacks and Russian Cossacks. You have a Cossacks in Don on Ural, which are Russian Cossacks. You have Ukrainian Cossack. So what is the difference between Ukrainian and Russian Cossacks? Very simple one. You could easily write Russian history without Cossacks. And most Russian history is written without Cossack. There is almost the Tsar of the emperor or the general secretary of Communist Party or president. So this is always the kind of history without society. But you cannot write Ukrainian history without the Cossacks, because the Cossacks will be the element, and they exactly exemplify, first of all, self-organization, and secondly, this kind of freedom fighters. At the core is differences, because basically this is the probably global problem, which is more probably so say for worse, for better or worse, resolved mostly in European continent. And the problem is how to limit a ruler, how to make his power limited, because otherwise you could hardly survive. And said, we have a limitless power. When you have a power ruler that could do anything he wants, so to say. So the thing is, so basically, Ukrainian had this concept that no ruler could have a limitless power. There always kind of tradition that the power has to be controlled or influenced by society, organized society. Mm-hmm. And this was not their invention. They borrowed this concept from the West, and basically through the venue of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which has the idea, which has king, but king was elected. And most importantly, king could rule, but could not govern. As I may say, he was CEO of the company, but not the owner of the company. He was hired by the nobility, so to say. And nobility has more to say than king himself. And Ukrainians Cossacks were fighting against the Polish state, but they were emulating this example. Because the idea was also they have a Cossack leader, but he has to be elected, and he was under control of the Cossack body. So this is exactly to give you the idea, which was very much then in 19th century developed and articulated by Ukrainian literature as a main kind of idea that Ukrainians are striving for freedom, they're against the strong leader, all the kind of things. In a sense, you could hardly imagine Ukrainian Stalin or Ukrainian Putin. This is something which is very alien to Ukrainian political tradition. I'm not saying it's democracy. Sometimes it's very much close to anarchy, but still, it's not a kind of, the story of the one ruler that controls of the society. This is not Ukrainian case, and therefore we could easily understand why Ukraine and Russia are so different.
Can we look a bit more at Ukraine's relationship with Europe, because this is a very sensitive point, it seems, for Putin. He feels he cannot afford to allow Ukraine to have this special relationship. He feels that Russia has a right to have hegemony over Ukraine and other countries. And yet Ukraine has historically been interacting with Europe for many centuries, and of course with Poland or Lithuania. Whereas for Russia, they were conquered by the Mongols, but they really related more to the East and the Asian landscape. And it seems that on the one hand, I think that it's Snyder who's making this point that Russia sees it needs Ukraine, it needs Kyiv to give it a kind of a legitimate door into Europe, and yet it feels on the periphery, but always pointing to Ukraine as if it was periphery, calling it the Ukraine, which means the periphery or the border. There's a tension here, isn't there, between Ukraine's history is so much more interfacing with Europe. There's been a porous border, if you like, with Europe that Russia hasn't had. Is that correct?
Yeah, so again, if I may draw some kind of parallel here, I would say the biggest similarity, the closest similarity in terms of history, language, and legacy is not between Ukraine and Russia; it's between Ukraine and Belarus. To a large extent, they follow similar track, and their language very similar, culture very similar, the kind of thing. But there is one difference, though, and this is very crucial. Because in Ukraine, there always has been a territory until the Second World War. There has been a territory which was outside of impact of Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, so to say. This was so-called West Ukraine. Before that, it was both West and Central Ukraine, together with Kiev, so to say. They were under other, so to say, cultural and political space. What I mean to say that unfortunately Belarus doesn't have this such a space, which was not beyond the Russian impact. What I mean to say, this non-Russian zone was extremely important for measures of identity, cultural activity, creating a historical kind of thing. Because since in the Russian Empire it was forbidden to have Ukrainian activity, this was activity was very much developing in these exactly non-Russian regions, especially in 19th century, which is part of the Habsburg Empire. In this sense, we are much closer to the people who were in the Habsburg Empire than the Russian Empire. This could go for, but basically talking about this kind of impact of the West, I would say that this impact that goes through the West, and this is mostly new isms like socialism, liberalism, feminism, Marxism, name it. They have extremely important result in these regions because this is where this identity has emerged under impact of these new ideologies. And this is exactly what many Russian thinkers thought, that this is kind of pity. It's a shame that this wouldn't happen in Russia, but happen in Ukraine. That said, I don't deny European character of Russia. I believe that Russia is also essentially very much Russian Europe, Russian country. But unfortunately, it failed to achieve this status. Let me just give you one example, probably that will do. So I would say that throughout the last 2 centuries or more, so there has been several attempts to make Russia normal European country, if I may say so. Say it was after the defeat of Russian Crimean War, there was a 20 years of the very liberal reforms under Alexander II. Or you have to may remember that after the fall of the Russian Empire, there was a 9 months of the developments and the reforms in the Russian Empire and efforts to create a normal European state, which were then formed by the Bolshevik coup d'etat and emerging communism. And also, I have to remind you that Putin came to power after practically 10 years of reforms under Gorbachev and Yeltsin. So what I'm trying to say, and this is, I believe, the biggest tragedy of Europe, but also neighboring states which are suffering for this Russian tragedy. You have like a Russian pendulum, because there are several attempts to move the pendulum to the West, to make European normal countries, so to say. But unfortunately, this pendulum has this move doesn't last that long. It get a reaction to the other side, and all the kind of reforms, there's efforts to normalize Russia, and with the even much more reactionary, aggressive regime, totalitarian regime, so to say, like a Bolshevik, like a Stalin, like a Putin, and this is a real tragedy. So the thing is, someone has to stop this pendulum to bring it into some normal position. Some Russian historians believed, and wrongly so, unfortunately, that this would stop. This was after the Putin regime. So they believe that Putin is the last attempt to swing the Russian pendulum in opposite direction. Unfortunately, this swing lasts too long because already 20 few years and actually ends in the wars against Russia. So what I mean to say, Ukraine was much more successful in this reparization. See what exactly I mean? Because Ukraine, even once Ukraine has left Russian space, Soviet space, it didn't have this kind of this pendulum never stopped. It swifted toward the west. It tilted to the west, and this is no, I believe, historical predetermination. I don't believe it's some kind of this was kind of written in the stars. Without a doubt, this thing could be turned differently. But then again, you have it because of the Terror to Maidans, which were against exactly this kind of the return to history, return back. And basically, I would say it's due to emergence of new population, a new generation. This is something very important. If you don't
Yes.
understand that generation change in Ukraine, you don't understand that much. Because basically what we have in Ukraine nowadays, since the last 20 years, emerges a new generation of a new middle, younger class, mostly urban class, very much educated, which is not, his identity is not rooted in language, but also some the values. And I think very simple. They want to live the same life as their peers in the East and the West, like Poles, like a French or German, so to say. And they do to a large extent Zelensky himself is embodiment of this generation. Nowadays, they're in the age of the 40-some, but they run the country. Just compare them to the age of Putin or Trump. The age of Putin and Trump is 70 plus. The age of the people who now run the Ukrainian country is 40 plus minus 5. And this gives you the idea, because this is exactly new generation emerged. Because for a variety of reasons, because Ukraine became open toward the West, because there was the two Maidans, because there was available information that Ukraine was a relatively democratic state, all the kind of things. This new generation nowadays runs the country and moving Ukraine toward the West. And this is exactly what Putin was afraid of, because he understood once the generation would emerge and would get the power, this Ukraine would be cut for as the last from the Russian Empire, and they could not claim. So for Putin, it's probably the last grab, the last effort to keep Ukraine, because otherwise he understands he would lose it forever.
Yeah. Yeah. The two terms were used quite a bit around the time of Maidan, and that was to describe the Homo Sovieticus, the Soviet man who just robotically followed the orders, or Homo Maidanus, that was people who thought for themselves, this critical view of history you're talking about, the critical memory, being prepared to take responsibility for their own present and future. Here we see this difference, this younger generation who really do represent this Homo Maidanus as opposed to Homo Sovieticus. But the church, tell me something about the differences between Russia and Ukraine in the church area as well, because it's very clear there's been a monolithic role for the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia, but historically there's been no one dominant church in Ukraine. Can you unpack that?
So I believe this is the crucial difference, and you picked very, very correctly so, because basically, unfortunately, again, in Russia, state and church, they merge with each other, so to say. And since they create a kind of the unity, total unity, it's very hard for the third actor to emerge, which is basically civil society. And this is a tragedy of Russia, and also playing by pendulum has stuck, so to say, because historical tradition, unfortunately so. Why in Ukraine is very much different, because Ukraine never had a state church, never, luckily enough. It still doesn't have, because you may know or not, but Ukraine there are at least 3 Eastern Christian churches nowadays, which is Kiev Patriarchate, Moscow Patriarchate, and Greek Catholic. I have not counted the minor churches, and neither of them are state church, so to say. And I believe this Ukraine, if I may say so, the short name for Ukraine is diversity, religious diversity, ethnic diversity. It's just the regional diversity, because since Ukraine is so much divided, it also could be a problem, but also an advantage, because if you have such diversity, you could run this country single-handedly. You have to strike a compromise. And compromise is bread and wine of democracy, so to say. And this is exactly when Ukraine is built against this compromise. And this has been a very interesting comparison. I believe is something which was mentioning, that this does make a difference, not just between Ukraine and Russia. It also made difference between Ukraine and most European countries, because in the most European countries, there's still a dominant religion. And it's not like Ukraine. In this sense, Ukraine could be more correctly compared to United States rather to Russia. This kind of diversity, so to say,
Yes.
dominations, all the kind of things. Also including not just Christians, but Muslims or Jews. Because look, one of the most loyal group to Ukrainian state is the Crimean Tatars, which are Muslims. Or given the fact that the Zelensky is a Jewish, as a part of his team is also a Jewish, so to say. And this is go on and on and on. So this is, I believe, the major difference. And again, as I say, this has historical precedence. because in many senses, what we could call Kiev school or Kiev church is different from Moscow church, because the Kiev church or Kiev theology was under a very strong impact on the Western theology. Let me put this way, the major difference was the Aristotle, if I may say so. I mean, the using of the rational arguments, which was very much embodied by the Thomas Aquinas, so to say.
Yes.
So what I'm saying to say that a Ukrainian church, willingly or not willingly, accepted this idea because it has to rival, to confront the Greek Catholicism or Protestantism, and the only way to fight with the rival, which is stronger, it was to emulate the rival, so to say. So what I'm trying to say, the first time that Aristotle appears in this territory was exactly in Kiev Mihail Academy, when the local monks and the priests started to reading Aristotle again. And Thomas Aquinas introducing this kind of theology. So in a sense, yes, Ukrainian church is very much Orthodox Eastern Christians, but under very strong impact, rational impact on the Western theology. And probably my church, to whom belong, is Greek Catholic Church, is probably the best embodiment, this kind of hybrid between Western and Eastern Christianity, so to say. So again, if I say the first feature of Ukraine is diversity, the second is the hybrid character, because this diversity is not just mechanical. There's different parts that come together and create some kind of the new quality, which is very much gives the idea, creates the quite different image of Ukraine than Russia. In a sense, again, I'm returning to this, because of this character of Ukraine, because the political tradition, Ukraine is very much horizontal oriented. This is horizontal ties with different society, different domination kind of thing, which live together. They have some rivalry, sometimes conflict, but they tend to compromise with each other. Unlike Russia, which is very strong vertical. In a sense, you could describe war against Russia, Ukraine. It's like a war between the vertical horizontal society and the vertical horizontal oriented society. In this case, also helps to understand why Ukraine is so persistent, because horizontal ties, they are much more stronger than vertical, so to say. Again, I will stop here.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you a different kind of question, and that is, which of the narratives, Putin's narrative or narrative you've been representing, does President Trump most closely follow? And what have been the consequences of his rhetoric and policies?
It's it's $1 million question, I believe, because I don't know that much about Trump, but I wonder if Trump himself knows about himself. But does he really understand? Knows history, so to say? Because I believe that Trump is the last president, or probably the president with less cares about the past, even so more knows the past, so to say, because he believes there's a president without precedent. He was the first one and the biggest one, but there is some similarity between Putin and him. I'm not talking about the ambition. No, this is thanks, because basically both Putin and Trump, they look back. This idea, let's make America great again. So which this presumption is that America once was great and let's do it again. That's the same like Putin is saying, let's raise Russia from the news. Let's make Russia great again. So basically, they're moving forward, but they're looking backward, so to say. They believe that there's some kind of the golden age in their history which should be restored and repeated. And I believe this is very dangerous. This is extremely dangerous because it leads to aggression. To aggression in case of Russia over the war. I believe that this is something saving grace for Ukraine, that Ukraine has no golden age in the history, because Ukraine history is so much filled with the violence, with the kind of the very dramatic, if not tragic events. Ukrainians have nowhere to return to, so to say. So the idea is both looking and moving forward rather backward. They want to leave the history behind, because you may know it or not, but probably you know it, especially after Timothy Snyder book, that Ukraine was probably one of the most dangerous places to live in the 20th century, and Ukraine is not willing to repeat it, so to say. Just give you the idea, probably the final touch. According to some estimation, since the 1914 beginning of the First World War until the 1946-45 end of the Second World War, for the last 30 years, every second male and every fourth female died in Ukraine of the violent deaths. One third. We could have a such historical precedent like a religious war in Germany or some kind of wars in China, but still, it's very much unprecedented. Ukrainians know how the history is harmful and how it's dangerous. They want to return to it, so to say. So this is exactly what makes Ukraine not to look back, unlike Trump or Putin, but move directly forward. So again, I say this is a new trend nowadays, a very dangerous trend. You could see it in Hungary nowadays. You could see probably in some part of Poland, even in Germany, I would say, that there was an idea that there's something went wrong and we have to return to where we started. And this is a return of history, that we have to restore the golden age. And I believe it's extremely dangerous. Even so, it's very much impossible position. You could not return back, but it's a very dangerous position. In the sense, I believe is to probably tell you something very important about the Trump way of thinking and his perception of his role and presence.
I want to quote something you wrote. You said that Ukraine needs not building, but rebuilding, or if you wish, renovating or transforming. That will bring it into the status of a nation with what is called sustainable growth. This is challenging, nearly impossible, but worth doing. So, what gives you hope about Ukraine's capacity to survive and thrive as a modern democratic nation?
Paradoxically, history. This is history that makes me sure that this is possible. I'm not saying it's written in the star, but I say it's a possible and very potential scenario. Two things make me think this way. First of all, since Ukrainians undergone this kind of violence, extreme violence, they managed to survive. I would say they were champions of survival. They know how to survive the things you say. It's very hard to win over Ukraine. Ukrainians are very persistent in this sense. You could easily see. So this is first choice. And this is probably encompasses the majority of Ukrainians. They have skills and capacities to stand and to survive and the kind of things and persist. But there's another trend, exactly this emergence of new generation. They are not willing to survive, just want to live normally. They have the new kind of values, not survival, but the self-expression, so to say. For them, it's extremely important to belong to a different space. And myself, I'm not this generation, I'm older than that, but I teaching my students, I work with the civic institutions, I have a lecture for business, all kind of thing, and I feel them, I know them, and I see the spirit, so to say. They're very strong at that. So this kind of mixture of the both persistence and the new trends, this mixture, this hybrid gives me kind of belief that this situation, Ukraine could really do it. And probably just another argument here. Ukraine, since its independence 30 some years, has experienced 2 revolutions and 2 wars. And this also gives the idea that Ukraine had a very turmoil times. And I would say, historically speaking, this is something that is not unique. If you look at the history of any G7 nations, you have the same story. When they became a new state, not a new nation, but new state, like England after the Cromwell Revolution, or France after the French Revolution, or anything like that, all of them had this kind of period of the very intensive, long political crisis and stability, wars and revolution for several decades. And this is exactly during this periods when the church start with the states or their nations changed dramatically their history, their trajectory. They became what they are now, this kind of G7 countries. So I see Ukraine is entering the same kind of the period or same kind of experience. And the good thing is that main spirit is transformation, reforms, moving toward the West, because moving to the West is not just kind of this kind of the, how should I put it, some kind of the weird ideas or dreams, because basically Ukrainians want to get into Europe for very pragmatic reasons, and this is reason very much related to Schuman idea, because Europe became, first time in history, unprecedented, the large zone where there is no war is imagined. This is no war zone. We know that French and Germany were fighting with each other for a long time, or French and Britain, or any kind of peace. Nowadays, it's impossible. So since Ukraine has the experience of extreme violence, they want to leave this extreme violence behind, and they want to enter European state because they sure European states is this no zone war, no war zone. Once they entered, they could relate, they resolve the issue of their security. And therefore, they want to leave the space, Russian space, because Russian space is extremely dangerous. It's dangerous because, this kind of Stalin, Putin, the kind of things, they have nothing to do with this space. So this is like a very pragmatic, so to say, ambition. And since they're very pragmatic, I believe Ukrainians can do it.
As Ukraine perseveres, what role do you think Ukraine could play? Let's call it in encouraging a kind of a moral renewal in the West. Ukrainians have shown the world that there's something worth dying for, and therefore something worth living for. Um, in the West, as seen, my father was involved in the Second World War, but my children, they've never faced any possibility, and hadn't really faced the possibility of being called up for a war. Um, it seems to me that through the perseverance and the suffering that Ukraine's going through, it could come to a place of being a moral model, if you like, have a lesson. The very fact that your president stood up and showed backbone when the rest of the leaders of the world were showing their lack of backbone. Uh, what role do you perceive Ukraine could play in the future?
So let me just start with saying that Zelensky did best work, but he couldn't do it if there was not Ukrainian nation behind, because it
No.
is of the spirit. It's
Yes.
not his decision. It was the spirit of the nation, so to say. They have to fight up and stand up, so to say. So this is something very important for me to say. Not just ignore the importance of Zelensky, but this is something you have to larger picture.
Yeah.
My colleague and friend Marcy Shore wrote an excellent book called European Maidan. Euromaidan in Kiev, and she made a very good point, which I believe very much related to your question. She said that postmodernism has died on Maidan because quite of a sudden you reveal there's a truth. There is a truth. There are values worth fighting for, so to say.
Yes.
This is something which is very definite, so to say. And I've been to Maidan and I couldn't express myself because I lack this capacity. But there was something spirit in the air. It's a very much metaphysical. It's very
Yeah.
much metaphysical, so to say. Those who've been in Maidan, and they saw people who on the front, this kind of thing. And it's very
Yes.
metaphysical in a sense because it gives the idea of renewal. That we couldn't live that much as we lived before, so to say. In 2014, during Maidan, several leading European intellectuals wrote a letter to their leaders, and they said, and I believe it's quoting verbatim, that Ukraine is now the best Europe you could imagine, as it was dreamt, imagined by the many European thinkers in the past, so to say. So this is exactly, I believe, why Ukraine is that important, because Ukraine does not represent these values. It lives according to these values, because otherwise you couldn't persist. I'm not talking this is values all the society, but it's this kind of the very much mobilized minority, which is embodied by this young generation. In this sense, I believe it gives a hope. In my understanding, what is Europe about? Europe is a constant crisis. Europe has been a very belligerent continent, and in Europe we evolved from one crisis to another. Let's not forget that the both First and Second World War match not in Asia, on Africa, or on South or North America, but in Europe, so to say. But still, where is my hope? Where I believe, where we Ukrainians then put my hope in Ukraine, because European crises, they quite often bring a resolution which works very positive for a longer time. And I believe European Union is a one part of the solution, so to say. So in a sense, you may say ironically or paradoxically, I believe that European Union badly needed some kind of crisis to renew itself. Because on this state of that Ukraine existed, it was hardly workable, so to say. So if I say so, if I may say so, probably Ukrainian crisis is exactly the crisis that the Europeans so much needed to reshape itself. And more so, I believe that Ukrainians nowadays give a chance. They're buying time for Europe with their resistance, buying chance to Ukraine to transform, because we
Yes.
understand we become living in more and more dangerous world. We're not in such a danger, jeopardy like we are now with global warming, all the kind of things, so to say. And the only way to deal with this is to transform itself very deeply. And part of this is a spiritual innovation. It's talking about values, so all the kind of thing. And this is something very important. It's also just the idea of Europe, but also the idea about the religion, Christianity per se. It's very important because let's not forget it. Let's face it, that Europe to a large extent was built on Judaic Christian tradition. This is something very important to me, as I say. So we need the renewal. Each of us need renewal. Ukraine need renewal. Christianity need renewal. Europe need renewal. And this is believed because exactly at that point we all come together. And this is not just Ukraine or Europe or the church. It's all of us combined. And it gives me a hope that in such combined efforts we could reach something which will be much better after this crisis will come to the end.
Thank you, Yaroslav. It's been extremely helpful to have this perspective and to end on this note of hope. Um, and in that light, I just want to point out that there has been an appeal that has come from the heart of Ukraine, actually from the Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations, to stand with us, and they're appealing to faith networks around the world, and particularly in Europe, in the light of what has been quite obvious, the lack of moral backbone from Western politicians and a lot of talk without the action behind it. And they're saying, in the light of all this moral ambiguity, we're asking the faith networks, please bring moral clarity. Please speak truth. Please call white, white, and black, black. And please pray for us. And so on August the 24th, it's the 34th Ukrainian Independence Day, and they have called, this council have called for the world to stand with them in prayer on that day. And if you go to prayforukraine.com.org, this website, you find all sorts of aids and posters and so on as to how to pray for Ukraine on this day. And in fact, President Zelensky is standing behind this effort. He will start a prayer chain on the 24th, which is a Sunday, so it's a time when churches will be coming together, and prayers can be prayed for Ukraine. And this prayer chain will go through for 24 hours till the next day, when the the national prayer breakfast will be held, presided over by President Zelensky, somewhere in Kyiv. And that will round off that day of prayer. And so we want churches everywhere, and even synagogues and mosques and so forth are being invited to be part of this, to come together to stand with Ukraine on that day. And if you go to this website, you'll see there a list of things to pray for. Now, by all means, yes, pray for Russia, because Russians need to be released from the oppressive regime that they're under as well. And Russia's welfare will be Ukraine's welfare and the world's welfare as well. So we'll leave you with that thought. Join us together on the 24th, wherever you are in the world. And you may want to listen to this recording again with other friends to hear what Yaroslav, the perspectives he's been able to give us today. And again, thank you very much for joining us on this month's Schuman Talk.
Thank you so much for your doing. We really appreciate it in Ukraine. We very much need your help, and thank you for your help. This is something that helps us to survive and to stand up and transform Ukraine.
Thank you.
Thank you.